All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. So welcome to This Panel Sucks, a vampire panel. My name is Daniel Greenberg. I'm an adjunct professor of computer game design at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. I'm also the founder of Winterion Game Studios, which is based out of DC. With me today are Richard and Alex.
Oh, hi. I'm Richard. I'm part of Winterion Game Studios since its introduction. I learned way too much about things that have no influence on my life, so that's why I'm here talking about vampires in Pennsylvania, 2 states away from where I live.
I'm Alex. During the day, I work as a HR specialist for Bethesda Game Studios, and at night I'm an actor, and on the weekends.
So just a quick warning. This should come as no surprise, but the images and topics in the panel may be disturbing to some. Vampirism is a pretty heady topic. Obviously, there's a lot of, sex and violence. So graphic content ahead, you have been warned. With it, let's take a little preview of kind of where we are coming from.
Just a few examples.
So, welcome everybody.
So, going back to some of the original material here, in Bram Stoker's Dracula, Van Helsing warns us, when they become such, there comes with the change the curse of immortality. They cannot die, but must go on age after age, adding new victims and multiplying the evils of the world. For all that die from preying of the undead become themselves undead and prey on their kind. And so the circle goes on, ever widening as the ripples from a stone thrown in the water. Which makes you wonder how in these worlds, how they ever stop vampirism and the spread of undead.
Daytime.
I guess. the sun existing is probably a good deterrent.
So that kind of gets us into our first topic. What is a vampire? So all vampires share in the act of drinking blood to sustain life after death. That's kind of the commonality. Behind that one commonality, there's additional linchpins that may or may not dictate what you're dealing with. Obviously, different worlds, different genres do different things. The term clan gets thrown around a little bit from Vampire the Masquerade, but it's kind of a good way to think of archetypes of vampires. For example, the noble vampire, your sort of Prince of Darkness, Count Dracula type, usually dressed to the nines, usually some specific set of powers, hypnotism, sort of that magnetic noble is one example.
Another example are the Daywalkers.
There we go.
So like Blade here, he's a vampire. He's actually a half vampire known as a Dampier. And they are impervious to the sunlight.
Right.
So in folklore, the stories about the Nosferatu were warnings about infectious diseases and like the decrepit creatures that spread them. They were mostly stories where the vampires were kind of in like dark crypts or tombstones, and they were in the forests. And then later on, vampires kind of infiltrated the cities and sort of became a suave seducer. Those were later stories that were warning people against strangers, letting men into your home when you were not married, and also the spread of STDs.
Right. So this sort of cautionary tale form that vampires take, two of the most notable figures in history that kind of get associated with vampires, and we'll go into them in a minute, are a lot of the inspiration for where vampire lore comes from. And a lot of what they said is sort of this intertwining of fiction and fact. So we'll talk, a little bit about sort of the historical truth behind the individuals that inspired vampires, but also the fiction that kind of got penned over the years that built up that mythos.
Right, and a lot of these stories have been around for hundreds of years, even before Dracula, even before John Polidori wrote these down, but they weren't written down. They were passed along by word of mouth between we want to talk later on about like Elizabeth Bathory, but like the servants of these lords, like these real historical figures who were afraid to ever talk about this kind of thing, so they had to just kind of whisper it to each other, and sometimes that got out and into the public, and that's how a lot of the stories started to spread. But later, when the 15th century, when the printing press was created, they were able to kind of get the word out a little bit more effectively, because it wasn't just the three people in your town anymore that could all tattle on each other. It was the world.
All right. So before we get into the penmanship, let's get into the inspirations. And there are two particularly notorious ones we're going to cover. The first should come as no surprise to anybody. Vlad III Dracula was a 15th century warlord who ruled over Wallachia, nicknamed Vlad the Impaler. He was a knight in the Order of the Dragon. Dracula is actually the former Dracul, which in Romania meant dragon at the time, although in modern Romania it now means devil instead of dragon. Goes to show what a reputation could do for you. All in all, he's estimated to have killed about 80,000 people over the time of his reign. For example, as retribution against some of the high-ranking boyars in his administration, he invited them all for a big party. There were about 200 people at a banquet, and he basically captured them all and forced them into slave labor until they died of exhaustion.
All the men.
All the men, right. And they were the lucky ones. So the guy was a bit of a butcher. He earned the nickname because of this event, Vlad Tempest or Vlad the Impaler. He was known, obviously, for taking individuals and bringing them up on pikes, kind of as an example. He ended up being dispatched by his brother some years into his reign, but he definitely left a lot of death and destruction in his wake.
Shout out to Brad the Impaler. So quick note, 80,000 people in the 15th century. We had Dan do the math while we were talking about getting all this together. It's like, at the time, 0.01% of the world's population that one guy is responsible for snuffing out.
And it wasn't just like people he was warring against, it was his own people. Like if you were a beggar or a homeless man, you got invited to his castle to be burned alive. Like that was just the kind of thing he did to help keep the peace.
Yeah, so don't be his enemy and don't be useless to him. That's pretty much the ways to not get killed by this guy.
The guy likes spikes. And that takes us to our other, I guess, inspiration, but sort of our other villain of the day.
Known as the Blood Countess, Elizabeth Bathory lived in a castle in the Carpathian Mountains in Hungary, and she married her husband when she was 15, and then he went off to the war. So while she was home bored, she would get the people who were working for her, these maidens from the village below, and she would, as punishment for them not, making the bed correctly or not giving her food on time, she would torture them. And then when her husband came home from war, he taught her some more ways to the battlefield torture techniques that he was learning on the job. So when he passed, she was widowed in the mountains, and it's rumored that she's killed over 600 people. She started having her servants invite people to come and work for her, and when they exhausted all of the women in the village, they started to open up a etiquette school where they taught noble women how to bow and curtsy and eat their forks. And again, if they acted up, they would be treated to torture and death. And it wasn't until noble men started to come and ask for their daughters or their sisters, and they turned up missing, that she was actually arrested and imprisoned in her own castle.
Yeah, weirdly, only when the rich people disappeared did anyone start asking, where's everybody in town?
Where's Alice?
The funny thing about that is that as we go on throughout this panel, you're going to see a lot more of that trend about privilege and things like that. That's baked into a lot of vampiric history. So just keep an eye out for it.
But Elizabeth Bathory was she was obviously off her rocker. She would have the women stand out naked in the snow and pour cold water on them until they froze to death. She'd have them stung to death by bees and other insects, so they would go into shock.
She predated the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge by 400 years.
Herself would bite them and claw at them, and the worst thing that, I guess the biggest scary ghost story, which is one of the start of real-life vampirism, is that she would bathe in the blood of her victims, and that would help rejuvenate her skin.
It's good for the pores, allegedly.
Neutrogena. They didn't have it.
They did not. So obviously, with the sort of increasing rumor or concept of vampirism comes, humans' natural response to it. So you start getting the first examples of vampire hunters in the real world. In Romanian mythology, you have the strigoi, from the verb striga to scream. These are spirits that have risen from the grave. And so you have humans that are afraid that people are kind of coming back to life. This concept of, the undead rising. Jure Aliovic, in the late 1500s, early 1600s, is the first person believed to have been described as a vampire, and so he's hunted down by these locals. He had terrorized his village, believed to be as many as 16 years after his death, which, question mark. And so as you get more and more of these examples, you have an island in Croatia, Lastovo, where the people decide, okay, well, we're going to start dealing with this vampirism thing. They don't know why everyone's dying, so they start, digging up graves and trying to figure out what's going on.
So when they opened the graves, they found normal examples of decomposition, which was their hair kept growing, their nails were growing, there was blood in their mouth, the gums would recede, showing big, long teeth, and they thought, oh my God, we have vampires. So that's when they started, the citizens assembled, and they had this vampire fighting group, and they would stake the dead and decapitate the dead, and they were safe.
From the very dead people being even more dead.
Oh, what a job.
So that kind of covers a little bit of where people were in their head and what was going on, in the Middle Ages. We swing around to the Age of Enlightenment, we start to get people kind of writing about these concepts too.
So I have a confession to make. When I was first approached to the idea for this panel, I agreed to it because I wanted to find out at what point in vampiric history did they start being seen as sexy. I had to know. Here's the answer. Ever since they have been put to the written word, they have been sexy. So in 1819, an author named John William Polidori, there was a writing contest. I forget who was hosting it, but he wrote a short story called The Vampire. Vampyre, because old English people. But this story was a scathing, thinly veiled commentary on Lord Byron, the English poet, who was a notorious promiscuous person. Like, he slept with everybody, he took advantage of everybody. It was rarely consensual, and when it was pretty derogatory even still. He was not a good dude. But, so the story follows Lord Ruthven, who, Lord Ruthven and the heroine Aubrey, who they traveled somewhere, and then he gets killed, or supposedly killed, but then he comes back later on, and after she swears an oath to never talk about him again, he comes back a year later and, like, marries her sister, and then drains her of her blood and runs away into the night. It is the point being that it's about powerful people using their abilities and using their privilege to worm their way into the lives of these less fortunate people.
Right.
And in 1897, Bram Stoker took it a step farther. It's still a count, he's still a nobleman, but he lives in a castle, and he invites people to his castle, and then that novel becomes a touchstone for how we know vampires today. His abilities are finally written down, that he can transform into a bat with the fog. He has superhuman strength and speed. He can crawl up walls. He can hypnotize you, or has used telepathy, and he has the ability to create other vampires and perpetuate the cycle. It also highlights Dracula's weaknesses, which were aversion to garlic, sunlight, and crucifixes. He's only allowed entry to a home if invited. He can only rest in his native soil, and he doesn't have a reflection, and he can't cross running water. So those are things that, when you think of a vampire, you normally think of, and then those are the things that kind of get turned on their head in the future.
Yeah. So Stoker really establishes a lot of these sort of rules of the road for vampires, right? A lot of their powers, a lot of their weaknesses. But the important distinction here is that it's one vampire. It's Dracula. There are other vampiric creatures in the story. He's got his terms but he really is kind of the focus of the story. And it's not really about his relationship with other vampires. It's about his relationship with the human world. But when we get to the 20th century, that gets turned a little bit. In the 1970s, Anne Rice begins her Vampire Chronicles series of books. And this is really the first exploration into more of the socio-cultural world of vampirism, right? How do vampires deal with each other? How do they deal with their own ethics and morality? The first and best known of those, Interview with the Vampire, right, deals with Lestat, who sort of revels in his vampirism and sort of this demonic nature of preying on humans, versus Louis, who is willing to be turned into a vampire. He's distraught, but then has to kind of live with this concept of what is it like to outlive anyone I love? What is it like to, be this person who preys on morals? I don't want to drink human blood, So you get that ethical quandary side of it too, but it doesn't relinquish any of what Bram Stoker provides. All of them still have supernatural strength and speed. They still have this sort of perpetual existence, and they still have gifts that they receive as part of being turned. Some of them can do things like read minds or set things on fire. And it sort of codifies this, it's a long-running series. It's well over a dozen books that she wrote. It kind of codifies this idea of vampire society.
And Twilight takes that a step further, and it's a more modernized retelling, but they're still beautiful vampires. They look like marble. They glisten in the sun. It's the new sexy vampire.
I wanted to blame Stephanie Meyer for the question, but I couldn't. There was too much precedent.
These vampires are a lot like Louis, where Edward's family is self-proclaimed vegetarian. They only eat animal blood, and that they live among society and deal with normal day-to-day things. It's just that they're vampires.
They also tone down a little bit on the strengths and weaknesses too, right?
Yeah, some of them have one gift. Edward can read minds, but then there's humans that can block those gifts. So there's a little bit of play there.
Yeah. But of course, this is not too many books. This is too many games. So let's get into the games. let's talk games. We're going to start with Gothic horror, as should come as no surprise, really. The Gothic horror genre draws its inspiration from both medieval Europe and the architecture of the Middle Ages, right? So it's got a very distinct look and feel. It's one of those sort of, you know it when you see it. Common tropes in Gothic horror include things like dark, foreboding castles. In some of these stories, the castle can itself be thought of as kind of one of the antagonists, or sort of this almost spiritual building. There's also supernatural perils. You don't usually get a lot of humor in Gothic horror. You might inject it to subvert the trope, but generally speaking, it relies more on this undercurrent of tension and fear than it does, levity. We're going to do some quick game examples here. You've got games like Darkest Dungeon, which is a modern dungeon crawler that has the Crimson Curse, so that was a way to inject vampirism into that game. It affects your party members in different ways, like boosting some attributes, making them vulnerable in other ways. And then V Rising, which is a new Rust-style game that's just come out recently, where vampires were defeated in the past, but now are just starting to rise again. And so it's a scenario that builds up and explains why you have to start doing construction and gathering, and it takes vampirism and kind of throws it into survival pool, right? It's a way to kind of try it in a different genre. But there are two big games we want to talk about in the Gothic horror. The first should come as no surprise.
Yeah, it's probably the one that you see a vampire and video game that sits together, you're going to think of Castlevania. So it's got, I think, 86 is when it first came out, and there's been something like 30 games that have come out with the name Castlevania attached to it. It was first released in Japan under the name Demon Castle Dracula, which is actually going to make a lot more sense too when we get to Kid Dracula later. But when it came to the US, some genius, and I do mean genius, called it Castlevania, thereby naming the entire genre for the rest of forever. So originally it follows the story of the Belmont clan, originally Simon Belmont. He takes his trusty whip, the vampire killer, and goes to Castle Dracula, who has risen after a 100-year slumber.
I wish.
God, I wish I could sleep that long. I get like 8 hours and I'm sick of sleeping. But yeah, so the first game introduced a lot of the kind of conventions you see throughout the whole series. The crosses, fire, bombs, that kind of a thing. You not only fight Dracula, but you've also got wraiths that show up. Frankenstein shows up in one of the games. Which also makes sense, by the way. I forgot to go over this when we were talking about Polidori, but the context where the vampire story was written is the same context where Frankenstein was originally written.
Right, yeah, Mary Shelley and Lord Byron were in the same, right? Yeah.
Right, so they kind of came out at the same time. So when they made the video game world at the same time, it's kind of a nice little poetic moment there. But yeah, you also got like Igor shows up, the mummy, Death shows up. I think it's like the level 5 boss. But later games, such as like Bloodlines, will start following not just Dracula, but also other vampire lore, and also like from like the world building of Dracula. For instance, Quincy Morris, the Texan from Dracula, is in, what's it, Castlevania 3? No, Bloodlines, that's what it was.
Yeah.
And then, of course, probably one of the most beloved characters in Castlevania, Alucard, shows up in 3, and then later on Symphony of the Night.
And the other one we're going to cover is Bloodborne.
So Bloodborne, at first, we didn't think this would qualify, but then you go to Castle Canehurst, and it is all vampire lore. Like when you first show up, you're going in a driverless carriage. There's all these bat and tick-like creatures that are crawling around. It's completely a vampire story. You're the blood drunk hunter, and even though you have blood dregs and that's how you power up, you are also offered by Queen Annalise to become a vile blood, which is basically a vampire. I mean, that's
you all your healing items are blood. You kill people, you loot their blood, you give their blood to your superior in a giant Gothic castle.
So basically, if you become a vile blood, it's a PvP faction that allows players to compete in an online leaderboard, and they collect the most dregs from their victims, and then you donate them to Queen Annalise.
Yeah, it's one of those games where, like, even if you're not a vampire in name, just take a look at the elements that are all there. Not only does it fit a lot of the vampirism, it's also, we talked about the gothic horror element of the castle or the environment itself trying to kill you, and this level of tension that permeates with the entire gameplay. And it's a FromSoft game. Everything is trying to kill you. They were built to make a game like this.
Sure.
And traditionally, vampires can't recover from attacks like fire or sunlight or beheading. But Queen Annalise gets completely annihilated, and there's this puddle of goo that's still like moving around. And the next time you see her, she's regenerated herself. She's come back together. So it kind of begs the question, like, is this level of immortality really worth it?
Yes, like T-1000, Queen Annalise, like things that have reduced to just puddle and then get back up.
Ugh.
All right.
At that point, just leave me there. I'm good, man. I had a good run. I'm out.
So now let's jump over to high fantasy. High fantasy differs from gothic horror. The most obvious way is that it plays on more magical or fantastical elements in its storytelling. It's a little more inspired by mythology and folklore. That's not to say that you don't see this drawn from, right? Everything is a spectrum. Castlevania decided to pull Medusa heads and send them on sinusoidal patterns at you. Obviously there's some overlap here. But high fantasy, we're thinking more wizards, dragons, less Bram Stoker, more Weiss Hickman. So a couple examples here. Even though it has sort of the color palette and style of it, the Legacy of Kain series really does bring in a lot of high fantasy elements. The cauldrons and the way that the protagonists behave in that series. That's an action-adventure game that lets you kind of control vampires who are fighting to restore balance in the world. And then the Final Fantasy series is one that has had vampires throughout, from the very first game having basically the boss named Vampire, who looked very much like Bela Lugosi, just stepped into an 8-bit machine, all the way to Final Fantasy XIV, the vampire Hesperos, who very much kind of looks like an Alucardish type character, who's a raid boss in FF14.
Yeah, his design. If anyone played a Walker here, it's straight out of Castlevania. The Hesperos is.
So we've got 3 examples here. The first one we're going to go into is a bit of a curveball. It's actually Suikoden.
It's not like my favorite game or anything. So Suikoden kind of stood out to us and me especially because the means of vampirism in Suikoden is different than what you might expect. It's not just I bite you or you drink of my blood and you are now a vampire. A lot of them are made through a magical curse. Suikoden has this whole story of 27 runes of true power, and they all have different domains. But there's one called the Moon Rune, and that is sort of what is able to create vampires. Sierra McCain has the rune. She eventually mastered it, and once mastered, she effed off to a forest somewhere to live. And then a bunch of people who were so sick of life eventually came to die at her hand. But rather than doing that, she turned them into runic vampires. Now, a runic vampire is different from the normal one because they don't have bloodlust, or they don't. While in presence of the Moon Rune, they're not prone to bloodlust, so they don't have to worry about the hunger. They can just kind of live in their quiet little forest commune in peace. Until at some point, some doucher named Necklord comes along and in the middle of a ritual, steals the Moon Rune, thereby restoring bloodlust, giving vampires 2 options: quietly perish, or become the monster that everyone thinks you are. So, by the time you're playing the Suikoden games, any vampire you see is there because of Necklord. So if you needed more reason to hate the guy, there's that for you. So neither of them are runic vampires or regular vampires. Neither of them are truly immortal. They just live for a really long time. Think of like D&D elves where they live for hundreds, thousands of years in some cases. It's that kind of thing. But in order to stop them, there are a couple of means, but only one true surefire mean of doing it. There's like vampire hunter clans that have shown up, like Suikoden 2. You'll see the Marley clan. They show up and they've learned a few rituals to trap and destroy lesser vampires. With Necklord, they end up needing like 3 different things. They need Sierra to come back and reclaim dominion of the Moon Rune. You need Victor wielding the Star Dragon sword, which is the embodiment of the Night Rune, which is basically Pokemon 4 times strong against the Moon Rune. And then you have the Marley clan who kind of make it all happen. But that's a lot of work to go through to kill a runic vampire, so it's kind of hard to do in that world, which is why we should be glad there's not that many of them.
Yeah. It's a really great example of how you can take this concept of vampirism and really kind of expand and go different directions with it, right? Like what causes someone to become a vampire? How do you deal with vampirism as a problem? And you can play with those rules a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. The next game we're going to talk about is actually Skyrim. we're going to talk about the Dawn Guard DLC expansion. Now, vampires have existed in the Elder Scrolls for plenty of installments, but primarily it's a little simpler. Like, as far back as Daggerfall, you can make your character take damage in holy places or in sunlight. You could acquire vampirism as like a debuff. But with the Elder Scrolls Online and with Skyrim, they really expanded on sort of what you can do as a vampire in these games. Your character can join the Dawn Guard, which is an organization that's hunting vampires, or you can actually cooperate with Lord Harkon in his plot. Without getting too much, he's basically just trying to blot out the sun. There's a ritual where they can take a bow, use the blood of one of their vampires. Again, playing with the origin of vampire mythos, these original vampires or true vampires in this world are ones that were created by a Daedra Lord, Molag Bal. And then if their blood combined with this ancient bow, fired directly at the sun, can blot the sun out, and then vampires will never have weak days. They'll always have strong nights and strong dark days. The game builds an entire tech tree where you can develop skills, you can cast magic, you can throw people around with like ragdoll physics and telekinesis. So it's nice because the plot integrates in a way that you can experience it as a vampire or battling vampires, but either way you still sort of go through the same general plot points and plot line, whether you're doing it, as a vampire lord or not. Also, vampirism is curable in the game. In your case, or in the case of the primary sort of the chief NPC that you're traveling along with, Serana, you have the ability to cure the vampirism rather than sort of live with it. Weirdly, though, you can also go through the entire main quest. Like, we stopped Lord Harkon. We're not going to blot out the sun. We did it. The day is saved. Walk outside, grab the bow, and immediately blot out the sun. With no social consequences whatsoever.
Is it Tuesday again? All right, cool.
One of the last things I want to mention about Skyrim before I move on, though, Skyrim does a really cool mechanical thing with vampirism. If you don't eat, you start to starve, you get really hungry. When you're hungry, you're desperate, but you're also more powerful, so you become a bit of a glass cannon. You're more vulnerable to things like fire, but you deal more damage with like a blood bolt spell. Conversely, if you feed recently, your vampirism level goes down, which means you don't deal as much damage, but you're also less vulnerable to things. So there's sort of a trade-off as you go. And the last game we're going to talk about is Witcher 3.
Last game in this genre.
In this genre. So vampires in Witcher there's plentiful amounts of vampires in this game. There's half man, half bat monsters, and then there's women that look like women and then turn into Brooke said. The higher vampires, specifically in the Blood and Wine DLC, shown here, they are impervious to sunlight, but they also don't really need blood to survive. They kind of drink blood as if it was like booze. Like, it's just like, oh yeah, I drink blood socially. And then they can only be killed by another high vampire, so no matter how much Geralt hits them and beats the crap out of them, they are impervious to his attacks. While lower vampires reflect the monster's bloodlust, higher vampires are often noble, so they kind of follow along in that Prince of Darkness motif. My favorite quest in Witcher, one of my favorites, is when you are going after a vampire, you see that he's been drinking blood, and all of the victims have one thing in common: they're all drunk. So you have to, as Geralt, get drunk in order to call out this catacon, who is like a bat-like creature. He doesn't like the sun. He goes only in the darkness, and he likes the catacon clan. They like shiny things and like sew them into their hair and stuff. But anyway, you call him out while you're drunk, so you can kind of see in the background here how everything is like blurry. So I think they did a really good job at like affecting how the player sees the world based on how, if he's sober or not. So how you fight isn't as easy. What you see isn't as like clear.
Yeah, and with a character like Geralt, because you have so many tools at your disposal, like as a monster hunter, oils, signs, silver versus steel sword and so forth, you have to kind of find clever ways to force you into, I guess, complicated situations or ways that Geralt has to try to challenge himself. So this quest, even just by being inebriated, right, it adds that layer of struggle because for all of his powers, he still gets drunk and he's still less coordinated when he's
And it
drunk.
also adds humor. Like in this world, which is completely dark and everybody's dying, there's this one quest line that actually kind of made you smile, which is like relieving.
It's important to have that in the game, no matter how dark. Just give the player a break once in a while.
Let's leave the dragons behind and move on to wallpaper. It's the Victorian era.
Yeah. So the Victorian genre, and you'll see this in a lot of, not just vampires, but in a lot of different means of fantasy. It's specific to the reign of Queen Victoria, which is somewhere in my history is hazy. It's somewhere in the 1830s to the 1900s. But your typical tropes are going to be class struggle, gender dynamics, urbanization, the advancements of the Enlightenment era. And how this applies to games is you're going to see a few examples of it in like Dracula Unleashed. It's an FMV adventure game, kind of follows Bram Stoker's Dracula, but 10 years after the events of the novel. Or a vampire story, which is again another adventure game, but point and click this time. It follows Mona, a young opera singer, as she tries to escape her fate and return home to Paris.
Yes. So we're going to look at a couple games in this one. The first one I just played recently, Game Pass, I believe. So if you have Game Pass, you can try it as well. It is Vampire. So Vampire is set in London during the First World War, and it coincides with the Spanish flu. So there's one sort of this interesting modern thing where this game came out in 2018 or 2019, and the games talk about things like wash your hands and wear masks and beware of things. And it's like
all those warning signs
it's hitting a lot harder now than I think it did when it released.
Ahead of its time, unfortunately.
The character that you play as Dr. Jonathan Reed, the way they set this up is really, really clever. You are a doctor who is, of course, ironically, someone who specializes in blood transfusions, who has turned into a vampire unwittingly. And all of a sudden, you now have the ethical dilemma of having bloodlust and wanting to eat people versus being a doctor and having sworn a Hippocratic oath, combined with the fact that London is falling apart around you. The NPCs in this game all have names, they all have personalities, you get to know them. Unfortunately, knowing someone is apparently Dr. Jonathan Reed's version of seasoning. The more you know about somebody, the tastier they are and the more experience they're worth. So as you learn more about the NPCs in the game, their blood meter goes up and they start being worth 1,000, 3,000, 5,000 experience points. And if you eat them, you can get a big chunk of points to gain more power, more strength, more resiliency, which you need because the cities are falling apart, they're filled with monsters and vampire hunter gangs.
You just start looking at your best friend of like 40 years, like the Forbidden Donut.
Delicious.
And with no fast travel map, the game kind of forces you to slog through and see the streets in real time and what's going on there, so you are always kind of aware of how bad things are. The game also forces you to accept that you may not be able to save everybody or, force you to kind of give in to that vampirism here and there, because when you sleep for the night to spend your experience points, things happen while you're sleeping. People who are sick that you didn't provide cures to may die, or their conditions may get worse. The streets may go from safe to less safe to completely, off the rails unsafe. And so your risks and dangers increase along with you spending experience. The game, again, from a mechanical standpoint, is balancing how much XP you pump into your character to get more abilities. With every time you choose to do so, you risk putting more of the townspeople in danger. And there's one other thing. Victorian stuff, you can't avoid class dynamics, and there is a lot of class dynamic that it comes up in the story here. Both the humans from different sides of town, the west end and the east end of London, getting different treatments from the hospital and different levels of safety there, all the way to the vampire world where you have these sort of acons who are these vampires in high society. They have, an upstate, or not upstate, they have an upscale establishment that they meet at and drink blood, versus the Skulls, who are forced to kind of live in the sewers, and they're sort of considered like the dregs of vampire society. Even though they're both intelligent, but the dregs, because they are not being treated well by the hospital and because they're kind of left to their own devices, when they get infected with the Spanish flu and this disease that's spreading around from people, it drives them crazy, so they kind of are seen as these mindless, lowly, almost zombie-like vampires, when they're really not. They're just kind of victims of circumstance. And the other game we're going to talk about a little bit is Van Helsing.
So this game is based off of the 2004 movie. And in fact, when you get the movie, when you have the DVD and you pop it in, there's the demo for this game, which the critics have said is better than the movie. Hugh Jackman actually is the voice of Van Helsing in the game, and I also recommend playing the game over the movie. But in this one, there's a lot of, it's sort of similar in Castlevania lore, where you're fighting a lot of different kinds of monsters. There's werewolves, there's Frankenstein, it's a whole monster mash kind of play. But the first person you fight is Mr. Hyde. But what's interesting about this one is Van Helsing is grappling a lot with, am I, the protagonist, a good person? Which I think is an interesting thing to have in any vampire story. Like, just because you're human, does that make you good? Just because I'm fighting for the church, and the church is my, I'm a contract killer for the church, but does that make me okay to actually kill these creatures when I find traits of, like, humanity in them?
Yeah. Our last genre we're going to cover is going to modern.
Yeah. So modern. The cool thing about the modern takes on vampirism is it starts to deal with like curses of today and tomorrow, but also like issues that arise from technology and advancements in society. Dystopian cities, politics, guns, all of those kinds of things. It's more about like how it doesn't really change what a vampire is, but it changes the scenario around them and how they have to adapt. Because you always think of like vampires as being like super intelligent, super smart people. They wouldn't just be living in their castle in Romania in the year 2022. I mean, maybe they would, but it would still have Wi-Fi.
Can't Grubhub out there.
Right. So examples of this might be, Blood Rain. It's an action series starring with Dampier Rain as she travels the world killing demons and Nazis on behalf of a secret society. She was also the first video game character to appear in Playboy. Nice. And in Metal Gear Solid 2, one of the primary antagonists, Vamp, is an Eastern European who seems to possess a number of vampiric traits, but all of his powers actually come from nanomachines, son. So,
again, sort of that whole like thematically vampire, but not technically vampires. Right. You can always kind of
a vampire by any other name, more or less.
And an important name in vampires that we should cover first and foremost is Vampire the Masquerade. I'm going to talk a little bit about Bloodlines, but first, just if you're not familiar with it, Vampire the Masquerade is a tabletop role-playing game that was made by White Wolf. It's probably the largest sort of trendsetter for like vampire rules for anything Sense and Rice. It codifies a lot of these concepts of clans, vampires with different powers, weaknesses, different origins. Plays with the vampire origin story a little bit, goes, biblical, children of Cain, antediluvians. The vampirism kind of is weakening by generations, and like most White Wolf games, there's sort of an apocalyptic end to it, which is to say vampires who are not capable of siring other vampires are a sign of the end times. This is set in Los Angeles and Santa Monica, California, and it follows along with you as an unwitting, recently sired vampire who has to kind of be immediately thrust and absorbed into the world of the Masquerade. It's this concept that vampires don't want to be known. They're much happier operating in the shadows, so you have to kind of learn to thrive under their society. As they deal with the sort of the organized power structure or the Camarilla, the anarchs who are well-intentioned but sort of freewheeling vampires, and the Sabbat who believe vampires should rule over humanity. And these factions are kind of constantly at war, so you're struggling with these inter-party dynamics as well as the individuals that you meet along the way. There's terrific voice acting in this. The game's got tons of dialogue. If you're into story-based RPGs and you missed this one somehow, highly, highly recommend it. And then the other game to mention is Resident Evil Village.
Resident Evil. So obviously one of the most recognizable vampire likes is Lady Dimitrescu. She's not actually a vampire, obviously, but she was turned into one basically because she has a hereditary blood disorder, and then when she was given the mold parasite as an experiment, she developed this enormous height. She developed the ability to extract her claws. She requires flesh to maintain control of her mutations, so that's why she requires blood. She's basically a modern-day Lady Bathory. She lives in her castle with her daughters, and her daughters do her bidding. They are also vampire-likes as well. Their power is they kind of turn into a swarm of insects, and then they go down to the village and they take maidens and they bring them back to the castle to be made into wine. They take the blood from the maidens and make them into a lovely, sanguine, virginous.
It's an outstanding vintage.
Lovely. During the final encounter, you discover that she has one more power, and that is to transform herself into like a final dragon form, which is shown here. And that kind of is like a sort of Dracula thing. When he goes into rage mode, you find it in Castlevania, you find it in, I guess a lot of games, where he changes forms from his human facade to this beast-like demon creature. And that, I thought that was a pretty cool revelation in this, that even in like a science-based game, that still kind of happened.
Yeah, that's obviously video games having bosses in multiple like forms and tiers is, it's a common thing, but it is also a thing that's very, very common in like vampires specifically. Having sort of the facade of your vampire, this sort of noble, buttoned-up shirt, converting into sort of the monster beneath, right? There's obviously, it's just dripping with symbolism. But it's both a mechanical thing and a...
And again, like from Lady Bathory's tales, she would be the most mad. She would kill the most women when she had to act noble. If she had an event and she was dealing with like parliamentary things and like signing off on stuff, then she'd be like, okay, go bring me 10 women to kill. Like it was like that...
Like stress relief.
The most morbid stress ball. But it doesn't all have to be that dark. With these genres out of the way, let's briefly talk about non-lethal vampires, or cute vampires. Non-lethal vampires mostly make their appearance in children's programming. Think Count Von Count from Sesame Street, Count Chocula, Vampirina. There have been games that do this as well. There's some common tropes that play here. Think things like substitutes for blood, Spike McFang's Super Nintendo game where you eat tomatoes instead of blood and you have little garlics running around that are the enemies you have to sweep away. Or the Incredible Dracula time management series, which is a lot of crafting and, bright, colorful, like, haha, I'm Dracula, oh no, I can't drive this car. Very, very sort of cute stuff.
Like Gardenscapes, but you're a vampire.
Yeah, like putting vampires in real world situations. Like, I'm a vampire and I'm gonna go get groceries.
Yeah. Like, I keep trying shirts on, but I can't tell if they fit or not.
But I can't see my reflection.
Yeah, but some of the like common tropes here, you also have things like fitting in, right? Problem kids may have, and you can take things like monsters or characters with different attributes, and you can play with this concept of what does it mean to fit into society or to be viewed a certain way. Musical numbers, family life. There's lots of ways you can play with vampirism in a way that makes it more of a learning tool or a sort of a veneer to explain concepts that you're trying to teach to younger audiences. But that's not to say we can't just have a little fun with it too, such as Castlevania, who decided to make Kid Dracula.
Yeah, Kid Dracula is probably one of the cutest games you will ever play. Like, the first boss of the first level is a little baby ghost, and when you beat it, it runs away crying and goes to get its mom, who comes in to fight you. And when you beat her, she runs away crying. The second level, you're going through this wonderful labyrinth in the clouds through the sky, and your final boss, the king of the skies, is a chicken. So it's kind of taking the darkness out of it while still being a vampire. It's really more of a parody than it is an extension of Castlevania proper, but we're glad to have it anyways. So what happens is the monster, Galamoth, which is basically like some alien thing, and it's not really well described.
It's like a mini Bowser.
Kinda, yeah. But he comes in and challenges Kid Dracula to reclaim the title of Demon King, which when we talk about the castle of the Demon Castle of Dracula, Castlevania, this kind of comes back to the whole Demon King trope. But so Kid Dracula takes his dad's cape, travels through the castle, the sky, the Arctic, and of course New York City, in a platformer that's really. It's only really half Castlevania, the other half is Mega Man, really, because you don't drink blood or you don't like kill things to get powers. But at the end of every level, you just gain a power up. It even says things like, you got fireball, you got turn into a bat, you know. And then there's a weird, it's Konami game, so of course there's a weird gambling mini game in between stages too, because why wouldn't there be? And so his powers, things like, you know, he can transform into a bat, which is overpowered because that flight mode lasts forever. He also has fireball, so he can freeze enemies. There's one where he gets to just turn gravity upside down and walk on the ceiling because vampire, I guess.
Yeah. It does make me want to play VVV when I watch it.
Yeah, a little bit. It's a little easier on the spatial reasoning than VVV is, though.
I think my two favorite things about Kid Dracula, one is, we've got it pictured up here. When you beat New York City, the Statue of Liberty shows, and it's like, well, I can't fight you, I'm the Statue of Liberty. So let's have a game show instead. And so the bosses from the previous two levels you were at, plus you, are competing in like a trivia contest as the boss of the level. And then finally, Kid Dracula's motivation, even though he's like got his dad's cape and he's chasing this demon away, he just wants the other monsters to think he's cool and hang out with them.
Yep.
So the victory screen there on the bottom left is after you've beaten the game, all the monsters, you know, the ghosts and witches, Frankenstein, like they're all just like, hey, you're cool, we'll hang out with you.
It's what it's like to be the Demon King, baby.
And then from not played a lot, but really cute, to played an absolute ton, The Sims.
The Sims. So The Sims had vampires as early as the second game. There's an expansion, Nightlife, where you can see them kind of like in the town at night. And then you can sort of, in Sims 3, you become vampires. You get the ability to get turned. And it's very instantaneous. You get bit, you turn, there's a bat cloud, and then later on there's a transitionary period. So in Sims 3, Sims 4, if you get bit, you get sick, you don't want to eat real food, you start having thirst instead of hunger. You can kind of, I think in Sims 3, as early as Sims 3, you can create a vampire from the start. So there's like the creation of what kind of vampire you want to be. And then in the last Sims, you can have a dark form that you transform into when you're using your vampire powers. So you can hypnotize other Sims. You can, if you're intimate with them, they let you bite their neck. Otherwise, they offer you the arm.
It's just discreet, yeah.
And then vampirism is another thing where you can undo it. You can make a potion, you can make a cocktail, and then decide to be human again.
Yeah, so you get to have a little fun with like the social side of it, right? Just kind of having vampires and non-vampires interact and just watch Madison Sue. I think I don't remember which one, maybe 3 onward, if you let your vampires get too thirsty, like they will start force hypnotizing people, which can negatively affect the relationship. So you have to be a little proactive about feeding if you want to keep your friends happy, which is kind of weird. But yeah, and then let's run over real quick, since we've got about 8 minutes, over to mechanics.
I'm a vampire! I'm a vampire! I'm a vampire! I'm a vampire!
So game mechanics and vampirism. Some of the questions to ask yourself if you're going to try to instill vampirism in a game, how do the rules work for your particular world, right? Do you already have an idea of how your vampires are made, how your vampires live, the power dynamics they have? The relationship between their existence and the world that they're in can go a long way toward defining what they need to do, right? What powers, weaknesses, things like that, they usually stem from some narrative requirement. So what is the reason to instill this stuff? Is it referential, or are you trying to pull out prior art? Like, do you want people to think of a certain thing that they're drawing from? Or more to the point, are you trying to use vampirism to fill in those specific requirements from the design world? Because that's going to go a long way towards answering your rules of play, right? Who is your prey? When are they available? How lethal is your hunting? Are you using your blood as health, mana, or both? When you're thinking about how you're going to display things on the screen from like user interface perspective, what is the relationship between blood and your vampire? Games like Vampire the Masquerade, it's your health, but it's also ways you look human or amplify your powers. You also draw from it, but to draw it is to risk killing people, which puts other meters like humanity or Masquerade at risk.
Or how you get blood. Like in Sims, you can get plasma packs that you just come out of the fridge and drink. You don't need to kill somebody or suck from them.
And getting back to the disease side of things, how do you manage the spread of vampirism, right? Are you a solitary vampire character a la Alucard, where this is not a factor or concern in your design? Or is it a thing where you can propagate and spread vampirism, and is that a good thing or a bad thing in your world? So how do characters appear before or after they've become inflicted with vampirism? Do you have the ability to manage that? Does the appearance change matter for things like NPCs or other player characters? Do you need indicators or some way to identify whether they are a vampire? And how does that play into a PvE or PvP style mechanic?
And then thinking about the vampire's powers and weaknesses, like can you get powers by the tasks you complete or the items you acquire? Is it the most blood you get, then you get more powers? Or if it's the hungrier you are, you have more powers? And then for weaknesses, showing that in the game itself. Like when you're playing the game and you go to a graveyard or like a holy area, are you slower to walk through it? If it's sunlight, do you get burned? Do you lose health as you're going into the daylight? Those kinds of elements.
Yeah. And then another aspect of vampirism you want to look at is, are your vampires heroes? Are they villains? Are they kind of a mix of both? How do they interact with the world? When you apply that to the player, like, how do you tell how you're doing in terms of your morality? Like, do you have like a BioWare sort of Paragon Renegade thing that kind of keeps track of your general reputation? So I mean, these are things that you can think about too, because like the great thing about those BioWare games is that like a lot of the dialogue options open up. You can, depending on where you are on the morality scale, and you can absolutely do that with whether you're a vampire who embraces the ferocious nature of themselves, or they're trying to reject that and be more like Louis from Interview with the Vampire. And when you're designing vampires, if you're going to put them in a world with a whole bunch of other kinds of monstrous races, like Suikoden has vampires, they also have genie folk, they've got the Fae, they have kobolds, a whole bunch of different things, and they all sort of interact with each other in different ways. So that's something to kind of keep in mind as well. Not just how vampires work within their own society, but how those societies clash or not with others that are already existing.
And so vampires can't die, therefore, inevitably, there must be more vampire stuff coming out. So a quick glance at what's coming down the pipe. Redfall, which is Arcane Studios, is due to come out later this year. It's a game where you are hunting vampires either individually or in a group, sort of like a team-based shooter. Nighthawks by Watch Eye Games is sort of like a social card-style game. Richard Corbett. Dracula for the ColecoVision is getting a fresh release here. There's obviously games get developed for older platforms by hobbyists and enthusiasts. And then Bloodlines 2, which we've been waiting for almost 20 years now, in theory is coming out. Paradox has the rights to it. That should be out sometime soon.
There's also Resident Evil Mercenaries mode that's coming out where you can actually play as Lady D.
In addition to games, we've got some shows.
What We Do in the Shadows got renewed for FX, so season 5 and 6 are going to be coming through there. Castlevania had its issue, but that's been cleared up, so there's going to be a new season of that, Castlevania Nocturne. And then Anne Rice, her world is getting a miniseries on AMC, so it's called Vampire Chronicles, so keep a lookout for that. I'm actually pretty excited for that one.
And that one's just brand new, so you can get in on the ground floor of that one if you are super intrigued.
Yeah.
We are a minute from our time, so we're just going to go ahead and show you this last slide. If you have any questions, we'll be
over here
field
somewhere.
stuff off screen, but you can reach us, info@winterion.com. You can find us at watch.winterion.com for any previous panels. We've been doing this since 2016, as well as episodes of our Let's Play show, Ion Gaming. We're still midway through season 5 of that now. So you can find about 600 episodes of YouTube content there. And with that, thank you all for being here.
Thanks, guys. We appreciate it.